Welcome to the Property Voice Podcast, helping you to navigate safely through the world of property investing. Get the lowdown and updates, insights and outcomes on all matters property with a splash of entertainment along the way. The Property Voice, a voice to trust among the crowd. Now, let's get started with your host, Richard Brown.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Property Voice Podcast. My name, as ever, is Richard Brown, and as always, it's a pleasure to have you join me on the show again today. Now, the idea of a Musings mini-series is that the topics are both random and often top of mind. And today's topic is definitely random, and some of you may be thinking when you hear it, how on earth is that top of your mind, Richard? But bear with me, and I shall reveal all. It's all about megatrends. Now, these are really big changes that we are already or will increasingly face in society over the next 10 to 50 years. So, okay, some of you right now might be saying, I don't really care what happens that far down the line. I mean, I may not even be here by then. But trust me, many of these megatrends will start to have an impact on our property investment decisions and property businesses today, or if not today, sometime in the coming future for sure. And if any of us have anything of a long-term plan or a legacy goal beyond our time here, then there definitely will be affecting us, that's for sure. So I know it's a big topic, and I'll attempt to boil it down to take it from 35,000 feet down to some more practical application, if you like. But at the same time, it is something of a high-level view. And I don't plan to go into intricate detail into every aspect. It's really just to give a taster of the subject and how it can have a bearing on our future strategic plans as property investors. Now, if it goes well, and I shall look to potentially go into further detail later, but I'll be basing that decision on your reaction and the download figures from this show. So I'll spare you from it if I don't get a positive reaction. But, obviously it's a little bit unconventional, but I like to sort of mix things up a little bit from time to time. So there we go. Megatrends is our big topic, and trust me when I tell you that it does have a bearing on us for sure. I'll give you some examples towards the end of the episode, which will illustrate some things that have happened in the past and have affected us or could be affecting us today to illustrate that. Then after the property chatter, which obviously is about megatrends, I've got a combined your voice and shout out to bring into the show today. And that comes in the form of a voicemail from Andy. And Andy's going to be telling us how we can potentially use the services of his not-for-profit organization to potentially help us in evaluating the emerging online letting agents that are out there right now. And he undertakes a kind of a review service, if you like, of online letting agents. So that's a very useful service. As I say, it's not for profit, so that can be an additional resource for us to use as well. So if nothing else, if you're not into the 35,000 feet stuff, and even though I am telling you it will make a difference at ground level, there's a very practical tool, if you like, to look forward to towards the end of the show. So stick around for that, if nothing else. But here we go with Property Chatter.
Okay, so let's get on with this week's featured topic with Property Chatter.
Megatrends. It's probably not the sort of thing you want to talk about down the pub, is it? But so what are they? Well, these are major shifts, if you like, that will shape our lives in the future, I guess is the best way of describing it. And in compiling the content for today's show, I've researched sources from Forbes, KPMG and PwC, among others. So some pretty heavyweight names in there in the news media and consultancy fraternity to help pull this together. And in all honesty, I have actually had this topic on my mind for quite some time. So it's kind of compelled me, if you like, to pull it together and to release this content in one go, which is the purpose of today's show. Now I'm going to be providing the links to those resources or sources in the show notes, so you can have a look at those in more detail, because I do plan to fly a little bit at a high level, and certainly those three sources will take you a little bit deeper than I plan to. Now, big businesses and consultancies, for example, Forbes, PwC, KPMG would be examples. Certainly some of those would be consultancies, but some of the big businesses as well are spending significant amounts of time and money in identifying and then understanding the big issues that will affect us in the future. Now, why is that? Well, because it will uncover both opportunities and threats to their businesses. That's why. So it's obviously an area that they're convinced is worth looking into, and just keep in mind why they're doing that. I guess it's to change their strategic plans for the long-term future. So we, of course, might not be like corporations like Google, IBM, Siemens, Facebook, and Amazon, just to name a few, who are some of the big names that are betting their future results on some of these megatrends. And I have had an inside view from certainly Microsoft and Siemens, who I used to work for in the past, who I know research in this area and do make decisions to their future technological and strategic advances. So, we might be small property investors at this point in time, but as I'll illustrate, it will be worth keeping an eye on this. And to illustrate that point a little bit, perhaps, I knew a fairly small property developer, and he once said to me, I'm just following the money. That was his phrase, and that always stuck with me. And what he was doing, he was looking at a larger scale investor in his local community, seeing what he was doing, and then he was just copying him. So what he did is he looked at larger developers who had more resources available to research trends and directions and strategies, and when they were doing things like new marina developments in the town of Folkestone, which is where he was following and in his footsteps and trying to invest in that local area as well. So that was an area of regeneration, and if you know the town, it will in fact lift the area and values for real estate property in that area too. So that was his philosophy, and I think it makes a lot of sense. So we don't always have to be first to market like that larger developer or like an IBM or a Siemens or a Google, for example. We don't have to be first to market and have deep pockets in order to win. But if we can be agile enough and flexible enough to catch up quickly, then we should do okay. So the point, therefore, is to be aware of changes that are coming up down the line, albeit 10 to 50 years, potentially in some of these cases. So at least we can factor these into our decision making. And you might be saying, well, 50 years I'm going to be in and out by then, so it won't matter. Well, some of these things I'm about to go through are actually starting to affect things today. So it isn't as that long-term thinking, I can assure you. So let me just give you an example. If you knew in advance that the cost of extracting coal combined with the decline in its selling price would ultimately lead to mass closure of coal mines back, 30 years ago or whenever it was when that industry fell into decline, would that affect your decision to invest in places like some of the small towns and villages in, say, North Derbyshire or Yorkshire? Now, there are obviously other places that were affected and blighted by the decline in the coal industry, but I'm just giving it as an illustration. So the question is, would that have affected your decision if you knew that information in advance? I think the answer is probably likely to be yes. Many of these towns and villages suffered tremendously, economically, socially, and led to house price stagnation or even decline, pressures on family budgets, reduced housing affordability general, etc. So that probably illustrates the point looking backwards. So obviously in the rearview mirror, it's probably easy to see that, and of course hindsight is a perfect science. But I'm using the idea of hindsight here to illustrate foresight, and that's what I'll really be looking at with some of these mega trends. So that was a coal mining industry illustration. Let's just contrast this with the government's education policy from around 20 or so years ago. Now, I have been leaving quite a few clues as to my age on this podcast, and one or two listeners have actually reminded me of that from time to time. So, forgive me for that, but, I did my university education a few years ago, let's say, and it was certainly before the rise in student numbers. But certainly round about 20 or so years ago, there was a big investment and a surge in university places for students. amongst other methods of learning. But I think university education was seen as the way to go. And around about in the 60s, only I think it was 2 to 5% people went to a university, and now it's around about 50%. School leavers end up going to university. So it was a significant upscaling in that industry. So that was the educational sector, but of course it had a spin-off effect, didn't it, in terms of universities, people leaving home, living in university towns and cities, and of course that meant housing demand, didn't it, for student accommodation. So investors in places like Bristol, Nottingham, Manchester, Durham even, which was probably also a former mining area coincidentally, but those towns and cities will testify that the student population explosion will have fueled local housing demand and driven up prices and rents as they came in. So again, would it have been worthwhile to have known that information in advance? Could it have affected our decision making if we'd have known that information and perhaps could have acted upon it? Again, I think you're probably going to say, yes, it would. So I'm just using a couple of illustrations from history, if you like, as hindsight examples to illustrate that why maybe you shouldn't just switch off and go and do something else instead. And bear with me and have a listen to some of these megatrends and how they could potentially shape our future foresight, and strategic direction. So let's just set the scene a little bit then. Big ideas of what the future may hold can make a big difference to us, even to our seemingly small by comparison property businesses. After all, our future standing may well depend on it, as I mentioned. So after that something of a preamble, let's dive into these megatrends a little further, shall we? Now I'm going to talk you through a table, and it's a 3-column table, so there you go, picture that in your mind's eye if you like, and I'm going to be covering 8 megatrends. So 8 by 3 table is what you've got in your mind right now. I'm going to be talking you through in the rest of the episode. There are potentially more than I'm covering here, but what I've tried to do is boil down the key ones, if you like, that I believe will have the most relevance to us as property investors. And so I'll be talking about what those megatrends are, what some of the key issues, and they'll just be the top 2 or 3 items from each area, top key issues that may affect us, and then some consequences perhaps for us to consider. And again, I'm not going to go into elaborate detail, perhaps 2 or 3 bullet points really, that which could be potential consequences onto our businesses. So it's not what I would call a PEST, P-E-S-T, political, economic, social, technology contingency plan that you might have heard about if you've studied any form of economics, as I did for my sins. But it is just to keep these things in mind and just have a think really about decisions that we're making today that we might have to live with for the next 10, 20, 30 years, or perhaps our descendants might have to live with the decisions that we make. So first of all, let's get them out there. What are the megatrends that I plan to cover in the course of this episode? And they are, in summary, people and society, sometimes known as population, urbanization, natural resources, technical. I just want to pause there because I said urbanization and there was a big loud horn outside, and I have noted that the environment I'm in is very urban, so sometimes you might actually hear a little bit of background noise that you might hear on busy streets in cities, and I'm going to leave it there for a little bit of atmospheric effect. So people and society, urbanization, natural resources, technological advancement, globalization, public finances, rise of the individual, and government complete the list of 8. Now, some people may include transport and healthcare into this list, amongst other ones, but I basically saw transport as a subsector of urbanization and healthcare as a subsection of people and society, in all honesty, so I didn't separate them out, and if nothing else, it kept my list down to something of a reasonable size as well. So to deal with them in turn, let's dive straight into it now. So the first megatrend then, if you like, in my table is people and society. It could have been labelled as population, as I mentioned. So really the idea is here that the key issues, if you like, that could concern us are there's going to be more people. We have a growing population, we have a growing global population, but we also have a growing country population here in the UK, as you're probably aware. So I think the figures are that we're forecasted to grow to something like 63 million population over the next, I think it's the next 5 to 10 years. So we've got a growing population. We're living longer is the main reason. There are other reasons such as immigration. There is an increased immigration and migration and mobility. So, and of course, whilst that's been very topical, certainly in the run-up to the last election, it was topical. There are various things that the government can and can't do in that respect. But the bottom line is we have a growing population, as I mentioned. And of course, as I mentioned, the demographic mix is changing at the same time, has been changing and continues to change. So, for example, there are now smaller household units on average, single-parent families, lone elderly people, singles, couples without children. There's more of those type of household units. So that's obviously having a change in the landscape. There are also things like changing or alternative working styles, working from home, self-employment, having more than one job, a portfolio career as it might be described. Job hopping is, people don't tend to stay in the same job now for life. That's long been gone. So these are some of the changing demographics and population factors, if you like, that could impact onto us. And in terms of consequences, what could this mean? Well, some of the things I've been observing, if you like, and picking up are things like shared accommodation. The greater use of high-rise accommodation will come back into vogue. Went out of vogue obviously because of those miserable high-rise apartments from the 60s and 70s, but I think inevitably it's going to come back into vogue, especially as we unravel this list of megatrends. You'll understand why that's the case. And indeed, micro-living, as I call it. So people sharing accommodation, whether that's generations of family or multi-let units where people break, we break a house down into room-based, studio-based accommodation. High-rise because of lack of land and high cost of land, so we go up as we can't go out. And then micro-living, it's a kind of a variation on the multi-let principle, but the idea of micro-living is, perhaps with things like ownership property rather than rental property is what I'm driving at there. There will, as I've hinted, be pressure on land and property prices as a result of this. And indeed some other factors I'm going to go through, and that's going to, all of this population explosion is going to lead to even greater housing demand. So there's some of the consequences that we might need, wish to think about. There's others that I haven't really mentioned, other kinds of trends, but just kind of really keep that in mind as the first one on the list. So that's the first one. The next one is urbanization. As I mentioned with the environment, I'm recording this. I am in a city environment right now, and there's all sorts of things that go on that I hope doesn't interrupt your enjoyment of the podcast. But just to give you a statistic, which is picked up from one of the sources I referred to earlier, and indeed I've heard quoted in many, many different places, is that back in 1800, only 2% of the world's population lived in cities. And as of now, for the first time in history, over 50%, so the majority, now live in cities. So that's quite a radical shift in terms of living patterns, moving away from the rural, farmland type of environment into the cityscape. So that's been an emerging trend. It's a continuing trend, and I think it's going to carry on going. Similarly, there's talk of what they call mega cities. So in addition to mega trends, we also have mega cities. Now, mega city is a city that has a population greater than 10 million people. So Greater London, the sort of London as a city, is the only one in the UK. We don't have any other cities that are anywhere close to that. But I think it's China has something like 20. Just to put it in context. So Germany has actually not so many because they tend to be more spread out. But mega cities, is a trend, but certainly urbanization, migration to cities, generally speaking, is a trend. So even the regional cities of Birmingham, Manchester, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Leeds, etc., will be increasing in population, generally speaking. Something to keep in mind. The economic strength of of our economies is moving and shifting towards cities, and that means things like service-based jobs are becoming more in demand and higher paying and requiring upskilled labor forces than say manufacturing was of old, or sort of farming and those sort of more traditional industries. So a shifting of industry, a shifting towards cities is what I'm really driving about there. In terms of consequences, what does it mean? It basically means migration to cities, people moving into the cities. So away from more small towns, villages and urban locations, and more so into cities, and that trend will continue. But of course, the consequences I hinted at earlier on will be that we require excellent transport links, because we're going to need to get around in the cities. And if you try to get around in places like London, for example, it can be very difficult when you try and use a car. So public transport is the point I'm driving at here, and therefore having good access to public transport links is going to be very important to people. So from our point of view as property investors, of course, we'll be looking to have properties which are within good access to transport links. And then, of course, as there's going to be more and more demand for living in cities, there's going to be more and more pressure on the planners. And only today, actually, when I recorded this episode, I saw that Boris in London has hit his target of 50,000 new dwellings from brownfield sites in London. So he actually, it's quite a successful policy, I'd say, that he's opened up, government-owned or public authority-owned land, and has fast-tracked planning to enable planning to take place to build more units in those city areas, because hard to build in the greenbelt, and also the demand is in the cities. So as I mentioned, more demand, changing for planning is required. So something to keep in mind for our own plans, of course. Next heading is natural resources. And I could have called this, any number of things, but just to keep it simple, natural resources. The key issues really are things like energy and energy sources. So, carbon fuels are in decline. Nuclear fuel is not that popular. So, as a result, energy prices are going to go up. And in fact, they're going to be in limited supply. Carbon fuel is in limited supply. So, having to seek out alternative energies is the point. Land shortages. So it's a resource, of course, land. So land shortages, particularly with what I've just said about living in cities, there's going to be less land available to build upon. Hence why I'm suggesting that micro units, high-rise units, shared accommodation is going to be, something that is going to be in high demand. And of course, climate change has been topical for quite some time, and indeed will continue to be so. So global warming, climate change, use of energy are going to be big issues going forward. So in terms of consequences, this is going to lead to higher costs of energy. As carbon fuels go down, we have to invest in either building nuclear reactors, which has a substantial investment that needs to be recovered. Alternatively, harvesting energy through alternative means such as wind, solar, marine, effectively tidal is what I was trying to say, energy sources, and the technology there is still expensive. So as a result, that means passing on higher energy costs to us. And alternative energy and flexible uses of resources is definitely going to be something that we need to look at going forward. And say we, of course, I'm talking about policymakers, but that has a bearing on us as property investors also. And indeed, new building materials will also be required as the expense and scarcity or availability of other materials, starts to run dry. Just to illustrate that last point, that I saw recently the development of a hay building block technique that's being used down in the southwest, as an alternative building material. That's the word I'm looking for. So the higher costs of energy, of course, are going to be, are going to lead us towards looking at smart homes and alternative energy supply. The alternative energies themselves are going to mean that just merely having basic gas and electricity main supply into homes is not necessarily going to be the only source these days. We might be seeing solar panels, we might be seeing heat pumps and this sort of thing being installed in properties to generate energy from other means and to store it and to use it that way, and even to put it back into the grid. So these are some of the ideas, if you like, that are out there. And, so the idea of the Victorian terrace, surviving in its current state for the next 50 years is, perhaps worth keeping in mind. So I think these are all going to lead to decisions on what people are going to be looking for in their homes as it goes forward. And of course, a lot of these points are interlinked, of course. And so the next one is technological advancement. I will talk about some of the things that, come out of some of the early ones. But technological advancements, things like disintermediation. That's quite a big word, isn't it? Basically, it means cutting out the middleman. Disintermediation. So, it's interesting, we've got a voicemail coming up later from Andy, and he's going to be talking about online letting agents. So online letting agents is a good example of disintermediation. We've seen trends in insurance, for example, and other sectors, where traditional direct-to-consumer retail or advisory services have been replaced by low-cost, online delivery. That's a classic example of disintermediation and the changing technology that helps us. Indeed, also the sharing economy. So, there's now, we all have access to internet. We can shop on eBay and Amazon, buy stuff globally. Equally, we can get a taxi from Uber on an app, and we can go on our holidays and use Airbnb. So, there's a number of examples there of this sharing economy and how this can be have an effect on us. And indeed, alternative design and building methodologies and techniques, which I'll explain a little bit in a second. So, some of the examples and how it can affect on us. So if we take retail as a case in point, disintermediation or the use of technology has led to what's called bricks and clicks businesses. So John Lewis, for example, has a store, but it also has a website, bricks and clicks. There are other providers who just have clicks. Amazon, classically, they don't have retail units. They just have an internet website where you can go and buy things. And I think I'm using some big brand name examples, but these will be emerging trends, and we shall see more and more service and retail delivery through online means. And indeed, I would predict another emerging trend of what I call pick and mix self-service. So if you take the idea, to the nth degree, we can move away from the high street estate agent or letting agent to an online letting agent, and you'll be pleased for me plugging this, but even to other service providers that allow you to pick and choose what services you actually want to deploy. So, for example, just some tenant referencing. Well, you can go now to places just to have that service delivered. So I don't want to go too far into it, but this whole idea of pick and mix services, I see that as coming downstream, and we can either use that to advantage, or it could impact us in some way. There could be new competitors that come into the landscape, perhaps that we didn't really consider. I mentioned Airbnb, for example. Now, you might think of it as just a short-term holiday, or town centre living provider, and possibly it is. But I think they are offering room rentals, fundamentally. So it is a competitor. Similarly, SpareRoom.com. And of course, with the recent changes in the budget in the UK, with incentivising homeowners to take in lodgers, you're going to see more use of sites like Spare Room and Airbnb to promote, spare accommodation inside houses. So, new competitor threat for us there. And next one up I've got as a potential consequence to us, I've written down posh beds in sheds. So everyone's aware of the whole beds in sheds idea, which of course is terrible, and I do not advocate in any way. But the idea of posh beds in sheds is, if you can imagine these sort of container-sized units, which have got, they're nicely appointed, they've perhaps got a fold-down bed, and a study in the garden type of thinking with living space, making use of the land that we already have available. That would be a good example. I've seen a number of developers now who are converting large units into micro units, so breaking them down even further with mezzanine floors and integrated appliances and this sort of thing, that in much smaller space. So making better use of space is another technological advancement, if you like. And then, overall technology, things like convergence and interconnectivity are going to have a bearing. So the idea of the smart home, for example. So, now you can actually install technology that allows you to control the temperature of your home when you're not there. Turn the lights on and off. These sorts of things. So just you think sort of laterally how these things could have a bearing onto us. And it's not just have a bearing, it's also about desirability. It's also about cost management. These are some of the consequences that come out of these megatrends that we might want to think about. The next big one is, of course, globalization. And, no one can escape the fact that we now live in a global economy. But in terms of some of the key issues, what it means is we now have much closer interlinked economies, don't we? So look at, what happens in Greece and what happens to it doesn't affect us so much here in the UK, but certainly what happened in Greece affected the whole Eurozone. You even had President Obama say, please, can we fix what's going on in Greece? As an illustration of how we're interlinked in terms of the economies. We've got change in the competitive landscape, if you like, as a result of globalization. Now we've got you can source anything from anywhere, pretty much. So, and whether that's products or services. And then we've also got shifts in wealth creation as well. So the traditional Western economies that used to have all the wealth, if you like, and assets now are, being transferred to some extent over to emerging economies. So there's a rebalancing, if you like. What does it all mean? Well, it means that we're going to be faced with increasingly more foreign investors. Now, those investors could be individuals who are looking to invest their wealth into the UK market, for example, or it could be institutional. Now, I mention that for a reason, that I think there will be a shift in the landscape in the private rented sector, that we will see more institutional investors come in. So they'll be both from, locally based, if you like, UK-based companies, such as the insurers, but I think they'll also come from further afield. Wouldn't surprise me if we had either directly or similar people to Blackstone, who are big in the US, for example, coming over to the UK or being replicated in the UK. So, something to keep in mind. I think the ideas of lots and lots of individual landlords, we might be coming under threat from larger foreign investors. And of course, that can also lead to foreign tenants as well. And, anyone who's been studying, if you like, the changes in immigration checks that we need to make as landlords will be aware that now we're an extension of border control. So we have to check on whether our tenant is entitled to be here. So that's just one very small example of how the globalization can affect us directly. There'll also, as I hinted, be longer-term shifts in wealth to the emerging economies, but also renewing economies. I don't know if that's an official term, it's one I've just created anyway. So a good example of a renewing economy is probably the United States, where they reinvented themselves really in terms of being a technology innovator in creating intellectual property and value through technology. So moved away from traditional industries and moved into technology. And so they're an example, if you like, of a renewing economy. And in the UK, it's been doing it as well with science and technology and financial services. So it isn't just the shift in wealth to the emerging economies, although that will happen. It's also those who are smart enough to adapt. And that's a good lesson for us to take away as well. And essentially, we're going to have one world economy. And so, that means that we, just to illustrate the point, we could renovate a home with workers from Eastern Europe and let it to Asian students and source materials from individuals on the internet from all over the world. So this whole idea of a one world economy means that we can essentially use that to advantage, or it could be a threat to us as well. The next area I wanted to consider is public finances. Now, if I mention quantitative easing, quantitative easing, debt to GDP ratios, bailouts, you kind of know what I mean here. That there has been something of a public finances crisis over the last few years, and that is going to have a bearing in the future. And there is an increasing wealth inequality that has been documented quite well, reduce tax income. There's a reduction in the number of tax-paying individuals, and that will increase as time goes by. I mentioned we've got an aging population, so there'll be more people who are retired and therefore not generating tax for the governments of this world to collect to fund our public services. So that will happen. Similarly, there is going to be, and already is, an increasing cost of welfare. So welfare in terms of health, education and pensions. These things are all putting a squeeze, if you like, on public finances. So what are some of the consequences of this? Well, for a start, there's going to be increasing squeeze on pensions and benefits. We're already starting to see that. As I mentioned, some of these things are starting to have a bearing now, but it's going to get worse. I mean, pensions in the UK are funded out of current contributions. They're not investment from our national insurance for us to draw down at a later date. They're funded out of current taxpayers. So, as I mentioned, there's going to be a squeeze on public finance. There, if you like, a public outcry and a rise in the underclass is another consequence that can come out here. And that will have a bearing on us as well, and we've already seen that with calls to regulate, if you like, in which I'll talk about also later, but in the private rented sector. And there's going to be a greater reliance on private institutional finance, for example, things like PPP, where it's privately funded government programs, so private money effectively coming in to provide public services, but also on individual finance. And we've seen a growing trend in things like P2P and crowdfunding. I think we're going to see more of that, and that can provide an opportunity for us, as you might expect. Rise of the individual is another headline, and what do I mean by this? Really, things like a bigger voice to people through the internet and social media, public protests and referenda that are taking place, and lobbying with the help of media power. Small voices can now be leveraged with media power to make big noise. So the consequence of this could be things like public naming and shaming. Only this week we've seen the poor plight of Cecil the lion, who was hunted illegally in Zimbabwe, wasn't it? And this hunter who's now being pilloried on the internet. Now, I'm not passing a judgment. I don't think he should have done it. By the way, I love animals, love lions especially. But the point I'm making is he was shamed publicly, and I don't know if there's going to be any wider consequences of that. But that's just one example. Now, just consider it from the point of view of individuals now being able to rate us, and on services such as the one Andy's going to promote. Letting agents, estate agents, landlords can all be rated now. There are services out there. We can have a name dragged through the mud on social media and forums and that sort of thing. There's going to be aggregation, if you like, of individual groups into powerful lobby groups. So Generation Rent is an example of that, a mobilization of individuals to create a powerful force and movement. And there's a trend of more separatism, if you like. Just look at Scotland. There was almost half the population of Scotland wanted it to be an independent country. We may even revisit that again in the future, after obviously the latest election results. So this move or this drive to separatism, and that's really going to give greater power to regions and local areas rather than just central government. Which leads me on quite nicely to my last point, which is government. And, what are the key issues? Doing more with less. Talked about squeeze on public finances, regulation and compliance that can't keep up with the pace of change, and this whole idea of 5-year political cycles. And the implications, of course, you're probably guessing, a smaller state, but also smaller service levels to follow. I don't know if you've ever tried to contact a council about anything these days, but basically the service levels are pretty shocking. You have to wait quite a long time, so because there's not enough money and there's been jobs that are being cut, etc. Higher regulation, yes. Low enforcement, probably. We've seen that recently, that there's, for example, now recently a law that all letting agents have to be part of a redress scheme. And I think it was Sheffield, wasn't it? It was Sheffield this week that reported, I think it was something like 4 out of 22 or 20 odd letting agents were publishing, so that wasn't the redress scheme, it was publishing fees on their website, wasn't it? But similarly with redress scheme, everyone has to be part of a redress scheme. And, these regulations have come in, but people are not adhering to them. But equally, there's not enough money now from government to enforce them and police them. So that's another consequence. And things like licensing schemes that, of course, we're seeing increasingly more come in. The licensing scheme is coming in, but who's actually enforcing it is the question. And then there are things like populist policies which come about as a result of this 5-year political cycle. The government of the day wants to get re-elected, so they introduce populist policies rather than long-term sustainable ones. So we are always sort of running on these shorter-term cycles and not really investing for the future. So there you go. So there, if you like, is my list of megatrends. I tried to point them out and some of the key issues that I can see as a result and some of the consequences onto us. Now, I mentioned that, I didn't really want to go a deep dive in this particular episode. That's as far as I wanted to take it today, and it was more of an awareness session, if you like. So the idea is, what can we do about it now that we know this? I did illustrate the point earlier with the coal mining industry, for example, didn't I? And I think, just to put it into some context now, as a result of what you've just heard, will you be rushing out to buy homes in rural villages and small towns? Or would it be better, perhaps, to consider investing into an existing or a growing city? Does letting to people reliant on welfare benefits look like a sustainable business model for the next 10 years or so? Or is there another growth area that might emerge instead? What will the discerning tenant of the future be looking for in their future home? Will it be single-skin walls with carbon-fueled heating systems and low-speed internet? Or on the other hand, will it be energy-efficient smart homes using all the latest alternative energy sources with a high-speed fibre-optic broadband connection in an inner-city inner-city centre close to a train station or tube station is what I intended to say. So these are some of the things that, I hope you get the picture that why am I bringing in this sort of 10 to 50 year horizon? It's because it's going to affect our business model. It's going to affect demand for housing, property prices, tenant demand, and that type of thing. So even if we don't start down this route now, today, it does help us to have an eye on what could be coming along downstream. And so that helps us to either plan right from the beginning or alternatively build in some flexibility into our business plans instead. And it's a point really is to make us look a little bit further than white kitchen units, magnolia walls and cappuccino carpets as the only trends of the day that are relevant to our investment decisions, because as I've just highlighted, there are several other mega trends that could have a very significant bearing on our business. And as my property developer friend said, we should follow the money. And if the money is finding out these things and is investing accordingly, then it wouldn't help for us to do the same. And on that bombshell, I shall leave it there for now. So I do want to share with you the voicemail from Andy that I received, and he's from trustedagents.org.uk. And not only did he have some nice things to say about us, but he also has a useful service to independently rate online letting agents as well. So let's hear from Andy now.
Hi Richard, this is Andy from trustedagents.org.uk. A few things that I'm trying to get into this 90 seconds. First of all, great site. I love how you curate so much great property news. I can know that can be one hell of a job because there is so much news out there. Secondly, this voicemail feature is awesome. I hadn't thought about it before, but it's so much easier and natural than typing out a big lengthy message. And finally, as I mentioned, I'm from trustedagents.org.uk, a non-profit comparison site for online estate agents, and it would be awesome if you could check us out and possibly add us to your resources. As I mentioned, we review online estate agents and I think it will be useful. Recording's coming to an end, so I'll just stop it there. But yeah, I hope to hear back soon. My email is andy@trustedagents.org.uk. Okay, thanks. Hope to hear from you soon. Bye-bye.
So I thought it was very fitting to share with you this today, as online letting agents are definitely an example of a disruptive emerging technology, and that's changing the way that we do business in that respect. equally, Andy's service also gives power to the voice of the individual as well. And so, he didn't know it probably when he left this message that it was going to be bang on topic and relevant to today's musings. So thanks, Andy, for that. Maybe it triggered my thinking somewhat to actually publish the episode as well. So that's a pretty good indication that perhaps there's something in this Megatrends stuff after all. I hope you see that, and maybe keep it in mind. And if you're not going to rush out and make massive changes today, just keep it in mind that there will be changes coming downstream. So it might be worth getting appraised and getting familiar with some of these Megatrends. And if you found it at all interesting or useful, let me know. And in fact, let me know directly. Why don't you drop me an email, podcast@thepropertyvoice.net. Alternatively, you can do what Andy did and just leave me a voicemail, which is via SpeakPipe, directly from the website. So you don't need a telephone, just do it straight into the microphone on your headset. Do that for me. I'd love to hear what you thought of today, and whether or not we face extinction or not, and whether or not you'd like to have a deeper dive into this area of Megatrends. But in the meantime, thank you very much for listening. And until next time on the Property Voice podcast, it's ciao ciao.
Thank you for listening today. Now head over to thepropertyvoice.net for more inspirational content and get updates through our mailing list. Join us next time on the Property Voice podcast. And if you enjoyed the show, please don't forget to rate us on iTunes.